Mesdames et messieurs, au nom de l'Université, je suis très heureux de vous souhaiter la bienvenue tout particulièrement ce soir ici dans le contexte des cérémonies que nous avons ou des activités que nous avons organisées à l'occasion du 10e anniversaire de l'entrée de la Suisse aux Nations Unies pour prendre acte de cet anniversaire et aussi pour réfléchir à ce que cet anniversaire veut dire, ce que la participation de la Suisse dans une nouvelle configuration à l'Organisation des Nations Unies représente pour aujourd'hui et pour demain. Et dans ce contexte, évidemment, d'avoir l'occasion d'accueillir ici M. Kassim Jomart-Tokayev, directeur général de l'Office des Nations Unies à Genève, est évidemment une occasion tout à fait exceptionnelle. Donc ces manifestations du 10e anniversaire, elles ont commencé le 10 septembre, jour anniversaire de cette entrée, vous vous en souvenez peut-être, la grande conférence donnée par le secrétaire général des Nations Unies, M. Ban Ki-moon, et le conseiller fédéral responsable du département des Affaires étrangères, M. Didier Burkhalter. Et pendant un mois, l'Université de Genève a eu l'occasion d'organiser une série de manifestations, je ne reviendrai pas sur toutes celles-ci, mais qui toutes impliquaient une interaction avec différents secteurs de l'Organisation des Nations Unies. Je pense en particulier à la conférence Nansen le 1er octobre, en collaboration avec le HCR, ou bien la table ronde qui a été organisée le 16 octobre, en collaboration avec la FAO à l'occasion de la journée mondiale de l'alimentation. Il y a également d'autres activités à l'intérieur des cours, mais donc inutile peut-être de revenir là-dessus. Sinon, pour remercier les Nations Unies qui ont participé activement et les collaborateurs des Nations Unies qui ont participé très activement à toutes ces manifestations et qui ont apporté un enrichissement très considérable à notre université, aux étudiants qui ont pu participer à des manifestations, à des conférences, à des colloques, à des discussions, et dans un contexte qui met parfaitement en valeur ce que d'être étudiant à l'Université de Genève, par exemple, représente, puisque d'avoir dans une petite ville comme la nôtre et avec une université comme la nôtre, la possibilité d'échanger, de comprendre ce qui se passe à l'échelle internationale par cette interaction avec les Nations Unies, c'est à l'évidence une opportunité tout à fait extraordinaire. Et j'aimerais profiter de ceci pour remercier alors personnellement Monsieur le directeur général de l'Office genevois des Nations Unies d'avoir encouragé cette collaboration. Depuis qu'il est arrivé à Genève il y a un peu plus d'une année, les relations ont été nombreuses, ont été constantes, et je crois qu'à titre personnel, j'aimerais le remercier non seulement parce que l'organisation apporte à Genève, mais ce que lui-même apporte à Genève. Et c'est dans ce contexte que nous avons souhaité l'inviter pour l'entendre ce soir et l'entendre parler, nous exposer sa perspective sur les défis multiples de la gouvernance mondiale, sur les enjeux que rencontre l'Organisation des Nations Unies au début de ce millénaire et aux enjeux que ceci représente pour notre avenir à tous. Monsieur Kassim Jomart-Tokayev est né en 1953. Il est diplômé de l'Institut d'État de Relations internationales de Moscou, de l'Institut de langue chinoise de Beijing et de l'Académie diplomatique du ministère des Affaires étrangères de la Fédération de Russie. Titulaire d'un doctorat en sciences politiques, il a écrit plusieurs livres et de nombreux articles sur les questions internationales. Diplomate de carrière, il a également été Premier ministre du Kazakhstan, ministre des Affaires étrangères du Kazakhstan, secrétaire d'État du Kazakhstan dans des configurations diverses et peu importe, il a représenté un apport extraordinairement important dans l'ouverture, la construction de l'Asie centrale et dans l'insertion de l'Asie centrale dans le monde d'aujourd'hui. Et j'aimerais terminer en citant une phrase des mémoires qu'il a publiées en 2004. Il était à l'époque ministre des Affaires étrangères du Kazakhstan et il écrivait dans ses mémoires « One thing is clear, the nations of the world don't have any doubts regarding the United Nations raison d'être. Humankind needs it. There's no alternative to it now. There won't be an alternative to it in the near future." At that time, Mr. Tokayev was Minister of Foreign Affairs of Kazakhstan. He is now senior member of the United Nations, will be interested to know whether this has changed his perspective on the need for the United Nations. Mr. Tokayev, the podium is yours.
Dear Mr. Vasali, first of all, I would like to express my appreciation for this very warm welcome. It's my pleasure and honor to be with you tonight. The Geneva University is one of the leading universities in the world, and I appreciate this opportunity to address the students as well as professors of this very distinguished university. The theme of my lecture is global governance from the United Nations perspective. We live in a very complicated world. We face so many challenges, and the problem of building up the global governance is extremely important. It is one of the major challenges and tasks we have to address while assessing the current situation in the world. I also would like to mention a specific and very important role of Switzerland, which is the host country here in Geneva for the United Nations agencies and organizations, specialized agencies of the United Nations. We appreciate the role of Switzerland, which joined the United Nations only 10 years ago. Within this very short period of time, Switzerland made an indispensable contribution to the United Nations, increasing the profile and record of our common organization. And it is not coincidence that it was the representative of Switzerland, Mr. Joseph Dice, the former president of your country, who was elected as president of the General Assembly of the United Nations. And he was absolutely successful in accomplishing his mission as President of the General Assembly of the United Nations. Yesterday, we celebrated United Nations Day, our birthday, and I'm very happy to be with you tonight, just on the following day of our common holiday, because, as I said, the United Nations belongs to the whole humankind. The United Nations is absolutely indispensable, and I did not change my assessment and view with regard to the United Nations. I strongly believe to the objectives and goals we all, the international community, either Switzerland or other countries, share while pursuing peace and safety around the world. The world has radically changed, either politically or economically and culturally. So tonight I would like to outline what I consider 4 major trends which will shape our societies in the years to come. First trend, economic and political diversity. The global economy has never been as fragmented as it is currently, with a combination of deflation, inflation, recession, and growth across countries and regions. We are all concerned about the financial crisis in Europe. We carefully follow the economic development of China, the second powerhouse in the world. And of course, the economic situation in the United States is a matter of primary interest and concern for all the peoples around the world. A new South-South bloc is forming with significant resources such as population, money, and brains. For example, in 2011, last year, 56% of Chinese exports went to other South countries, which illustrates this trend. The rise of BRICS, this is a new alliance or grouping or arrangement of emerging economies like Brazil, including Brazil, Russia, China, and India. The formation of the G20, which is familiar to you, and limitations in the ability of the international financial institutions to control the economic crisis challenge our understanding of what multilateralism is and what it can achieve. We see the emergence of governance and power structures that cut across traditional regional contexts, security, and economic spheres of interest, and link countries in new ways. In general, the whole world is becoming increasingly multidimensional, controversial, and less secure. Second trend, growing inequality. We live in a world of contradictions and discrepancies, a world where 2.3 billion people are connected to the internet, and where 1.5 billion people do not have access to electricity. A world where global military expenditure has topped $1.7 trillion US, but where more than 1 billion people still live in poverty. A world where today's generation of youth is the largest we have ever known, while it is projected that by 2050, the number of people over 60 will reach 2 billion, exceeding the number of children. A world where the top 20% of the population enjoys more than 70% of the total income. This translates into a world of growing disparities within and across different groups. This has the potential to entrench divisions and create new fault lines. Third trend, greater connectivity. According to the International Telecommunication Union, the world had 6 billion mobile phone subscriptions at the end of last year, an increase of some 600 million from 2010. 1 billion of these are in China, and India is expected to hit the 1 billion mark this year. The change in pace and extent of communication is a defining feature of our era. When I was a young student in Moscow, I had to go to the post office to give a call to my native town in Kazakhstan, and I had to wait longer than 1 hour, exactly, to get a call to my native town. So precisely 1 hour. Today, we can send SMS, email, or tweet any corner of the world. So it happened just within 30 years. Who could predict that 30 years ago that the world would change in such a radical manner? But this is also an area where we see the discrepancies most starkly. Most of us could not imagine daily life without internet. Yet, 2/3 of the world's population is not yet online. This includes 3/4 of the population in the developing world. At the same time, the most dynamic performers in the ITU's ICT Development Index are primarily from developing countries. I believe that how we manage and facilitate access to ICTs will determine how successful we are in meeting today's development challenges. Fourth trend, interconnected challenges and new threats. Prolonged economic crisis, unemployment, a rise in intolerance, social instability, poverty, climate change, illegal drug trade, human trafficking, proliferation of nuclear materials. None of these issues can be seen or solved in isolation. This is our common challenge, and we should commonly take measures to address these challenges. We need comprehensive solutions. From my point of view, the United Nations has not yet played the role it is expected to by peoples around the world. Certainly, there are visible achievements, but there are also evident setbacks. We face a challenge in narrowing the gap between expectations and results. Connectivity brings opportunities and new vulnerabilities. Cybersecurity has emerged as one of our key challenges. Cyber attacks against transportation systems, electricity, networks, or chemical or nuclear facilities are quite possible. If carried out, would result in high numbers of civilian casualties and cause extensive material damage. We cannot afford to be complacent. What do these complex and sometimes contradictory trends mean for the United Nations? Is multilateralism really in crisis? If we want to look ahead, I think it is instructive first to look back, to consider the lessons of the United Nations' predecessor, the League of Nations. In Geneva, we are reminded of the legacy of the League of Nations on a daily basis because of the presence of the Palais des Nations, which served as its headquarters. But the lessons of the League of Nations transcend Geneva, and they transcend time. While being justifiably critical of the League of Nations and its legacy, we should, however, also admit that without the League of Nations, the United Nations would not have been possible. First lesson from this assessment. Institutional structures cannot make up for a lack of political will or principled action. In a speech to youth in Zurich in 1946, Winston Churchill famously said of the League of Nations that it did not fail because of its principles or conceptions. It failed because these principles were deserted by those states who had brought it into being. It failed because the governments of those days feared to face the facts and act while time remained. The same is true of the United Nations. Whenever we allow the United Nations to turn a blind eye to abuses of human rights, to indiscriminate attacks on civilians, to denial of opportunities to fellow human beings, we run the risk of undermining our common organization. Second lesson, institutional design must be flexible. I believe that the United Nations has principally stood the test of time due to the enduring relevance and universality of its values. At the same time, the institutional design has been sufficiently flexible to allow adaptation and adjustment to new challenges. Innovation is possible. As an example, to address the challenges of failed states, United Nations peacekeeping has developed in scope and breadth of mandates based on an ongoing review process. In line with the need to address recurring conflict situations in fragile states, the Peacebuilding Commission, which was established in 2005, includes members drawn from 3 principal organs of the organization, as well as international, financial, and regional organizations, in a unique institutional format. The Commission responds both to a new substantive need, peace building, and to a need for an inclusive approach. Third lesson, real results are built over time. Key components of the United Nations, such as High Commissioner for Refugees, the World Health Organization, and the regional commissions, trace their roots to the League of Nations. They have built up expertise, networks, credibility, and legitimacy over years. We now live in a world where reporting in real time creates expectations for solutions in real time. But substantive, lasting institutional change and changes in attitude take time. It is often not a linear process. We face a very significant challenge as policymakers and global citizens in managing expectations. Together, these lessons can help guide our work to allow the United Nations to fulfill its role in our transforming world. Let me highlight four key areas where I believe we must place emphasis as the international community and where the United Nations can play a uniquely valuable role in policy making, in norm setting, and at an operational level, in line with the Secretary General's vision for a central for the United Nations in global governance. First, we need to strengthen processes for democratization and empowerment of citizens. The uprising in the Middle East showed that people everywhere aspire to democracy, in whatever form they may take, even when they have lived long without it. The Arab Spring has generated much writing about the causes and implications, and about the role of social media in shaping current events. One of the more thoughtful analyses can be found in Philip Saib's book, Real-Time Diplomacy, where he argues that media do not create revolutions. People with courage do. Our challenge is to ensure that the courageous women and men are supported by processes and structures that ensure lasting change. The Arab Spring is part of a natural evolution towards more freedom and more inclusive governance. But it is a fragile process that must be nurtured with a focus on promotion and protection of human rights and strengthening of the rule of law. We should always keep in mind the need to generate an economic build-up in countries in transition to democracy. Otherwise, democracy itself will be compromised. Slogans and ideas have limited effect for the people who seek real changes. Democracy has a chance to be durable if it is grounded in concrete economic achievements. The empowerment of women and youth must be at the center of these efforts, and it is a top priority of the Secretary General in his strategy to enhance the role of the United Nations. Half of the world's population are women, and half are under 25 years of age. We need to include women in decision-making processes, in political institutions, and in the private sector. We must never lose sight of the tragic statistics according to which 10 million underage girls have to become wives each year. 10 million underage girls. And more than half of them dying while giving birth because they are underage. They are not physically prepared for that. A brave girl from Pakistan has inspired us all by courageously standing up to the Taliban, demanding the right of girls to go to school. Her name is Malala, and I tweeted in my personal account wishing her quick recovery. I really admire her courage because she was demanding in the very complicated political circumstances, demanding her right as well as the right of other girls to go to school, to get education. We must also create conditions that allow youth to contribute meaningfully to their societies, not least through decent work. Global youth unemployment rates are at record levels at 40%, with 75 million young people looking for work. Young people are 3 times as likely to be unemployed as adults. Economic empowerment and political empowerment must go hand in hand. Above all, democracy must be based on respect for the rule of law. This is a key basic element, which is also the principal pillar of long-term stability. The Charter of the United Nations, which we celebrate today, provides a key framework in this respect. The highest standards of the rule of law must be upheld in political decision-making as well as in implementation of policy and in judicial systems. Second, we must advance sustainable development. We currently use 50% more resources than our planet can provide. 50% more resources than our planet can provide. This is not sustainable, and it cannot be our choice. We have made significant progress towards realizing the Millennium Development Goals. Global targets on poverty, slums, and parity between girls and boys in primary education have already been met ahead of the 2015 deadline. But challenges remain. 2.5 billion people do not have access to sanitation. It means that 37% of the global population have no access to the sanitation, have no toilets. 780 million people do not have access to clean water. Some 3,000 children die every day of preventable causes such as diarrhea, cholera, and other diseases. Despite the success of the Millennium Development Goals, in focusing political attention and practical efforts on development, we will need to continue the work beyond 2015, based on lessons learned. As far as you know, Millennium Development Goals target on the year of 2015, but the Secretary General of the United Nations, as well as the whole Secretariat, now think what to do after 2015. And for this reason, special board of eminent people, persons, was established in order to think over or about the strategy of the United Nations in post-Rio period of time. There is a need to address aspects of development, such as democracy, political inclusion, and security, that are not reflected in the current framework. We need sustainable development goals that take into account the need for green growth, which is extremely important, the potential of the ICTs, and the importance of the rule of law. We must pay particular attention to food security. This goal must become our top priority, and it is a top priority for the United Nations. We have some positive cases and developments, particularly in Somalia, in Sahel. But still, we need some additional measures in order to address the problem of food security. And speaking about Sahel, the Secretary General appointed a very prominent politician, the former Prime Minister of Italy and former President of the European Commission, Romano Prodi, to be his special representative on Sahel, the zone in Africa which suffers a lot from poverty and malnutrition. It is expected that food prices will increase across the world already over the next 4 or 5 months. This is a very alarming trend. This could lead to social unrest, inflationary pressures, and even starvation in many countries. Sustainable development also requires us to strengthen efforts for disarmament and non-proliferation. Disarmament and non-proliferation are truly global and uniquely existential challenges. The world is overarmed and peace is underfunded, as Secretary General Mr. Ban Ki-moon has reminded us recently. Global military spending now reportedly exceeds 1.7 trillion US dollars. 1.7 trillion US dollars. This is more than $4.6 billion a day. You can imagine, $4.6 billion a day. Almost twice what the United Nations regular budget is for 1 year. This is neither a sustainable nor a credible use of resources in today's world. Third, we need to engage all stakeholders. Sometimes, when you look across Lake Léman, the Palais des Nations can look a little like an ivory tower or a fortress. But this is not the United Nations of today. We need to, and we do, engage regional organizations, civil society, and the private sector. Research and academia is also a privileged partner. In an era of complex, interconnected challenges, we need independent research that can ask critical questions, alert us to new trends, and provide ideas and innovation. Geneva's traditions in this area are a strength for the United Nations system globally. I believe that there is scope for enhancing the relations between our communities, not least when it comes to the natural sciences. Climate change, cybersecurity, food security, these are all challenges where science needs to be part of the solution. Fourth, we need to recommit to our shared values and priorities. The economic crisis challenges to our security, growing demands from people across the world for a stake in their future have unleashed a necessary debate about the principles on which we base our societies. Here again, young people often lead the way. A survey this summer by Net Impact showed that more than 70% of college graduates and 50% of workers are looking for jobs with a social impact. Nearly 60% of students were willing to take a pay cut in order to work for a company that represents their values. We can all be inspired by this readiness to combine activism with professional pursuits, by the commitment to working for a better world on a daily basis. It is the same commitment, the same social conscience, and sense of responsibility that has driven many of the developments in the Arab Spring, even if the circumstances were different. This is the basis for the sustained and principled action that we need to build an equitable, prosperous, and sustainable international community. Once again, I would like to mention this my deep conviction that the United Nations is a powerful but also a precious instrument. The United Nations is not the world government. The United Nations is our organization. It belongs to us. As someone who represents the United Nations, I am firmly committed to bolstering it, to increasing the role of the United Nations. It is indispensable. We have no alternatives around the world. Although the United Nations is very often becomes a subject of criticism, but we have no other organization. So our duty is to help the United Nations, to bolster it, to increase the potential of the United Nations, and very much hopeful about the youth that may play and does play a very important role as far as peace and security concerns. And once again, I would like to wish the students of the Geneva University many successes, not only in your studies, but beyond, as good citizens of this universe, as good citizens of this globe. And also, once again, I would like to express my thanks to the rector, Mr. Vasari, and other professors of the university. I really enjoy our close cooperation. Thank you so much.
On behalf of the Rector and the University, I would like to thank Mr. Tokayev for this, I think, very thought-provoking, uplifting, and I think also positive lecture that he has just delivered to us. The Rector has just asked me also to thank the Jimun, who has, of course, participated in this event, so I shall do so at this point. We now have a question period that opens, and I would like to make 2 points before I go and join Mr. Tokayev. The first is that there are a lot of people here, and the time is, of course, limited. So I would ask those of you who ask questions to be succinct, to the point, and not to introduce your question with too much background information. Secondly, of course, you are welcome to place your question in English or in French, the way it will suit you to do so. So we can open the question session, I think, straight away. I'm looking already for the first question. We have people with microphones who will come round and make you audible. We have the first question here.
Thank you, Mr. Tokayev. My name is Azamat Rakimov, journalist, Nasha Gazeta, Russian magazine in Switzerland. You have just talked about the process of democratization, which is a very difficult process going in all around the world. And today, Mr. Didier Buchhalter has met the Russian Minister for Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, where they have discussed the situation in Syria. And they have underlined the importance of Geneva talks, which didn't bring really good and real practical results. How do you see the results of those Geneva talks, and how do you see the role of the United Nations in the process of democratization in Syria? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. My assessment, my view of the Geneva talks on Syria is quite positive. On the 30th of June this year, the foreign ministers of P5, major countries, permanent members of the Security Council, plus foreign ministers of other countries, including Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and also the chief of the foreign policy of the European Union, Catherine Ashton. We're here in Geneva discussing the issues relating to the situation in Syria. And I would say that this meeting, and I was also attending the meeting chaired by the Secretary General of the United Nations and also his special envoy, former special envoy, Mr. Kofi Annan. So the meeting was quite successful because it succeeded to produce the document, a very important document, statement, which has laid down major principles of the solution of the Syrian crisis. And until now, we have no other documents. This is a single one, which has been produced in the margins of the United Nations here in Geneva. So we must be proud that it was Geneva which somehow provided good circumstances and good environment for this very productive meeting. But the problem is that the statement which has been issued here in Geneva has not been implemented. And the former special envoy, Kofi Annan, in his recent interview also expressed his concern about this case, saying that there were major principles, the ceasefire, the respect of the interests of all conflicting sides. But then there was no follow-up. So I think that foreign ministers, those of Switzerland and Russian Federation, while expressing their concern about and disappointment about the lack of follow-up of the Geneva discussions, at the same time should have admitted the importance of the document which was issued here on the collective basis. Thank you.
We have a question over here.
Je vais m'exprimer en français. Il semble que les Nations Unies expriment la contradiction des pays plutôt que l'idéal vers lequel ils doivent tendre. Les Nations Unies sont nées en 1947-45 et depuis il y a eu une révolution des États et on se demande si les Nations Unies ne doivent pas aussi opérer une révolution de manière à avoir une parole plus indépendante, plus forte et qui exprime davantage l'idéal des nations et non pas leurs contradictions. Est-ce qu'il y a des choses qui sont faites dans ce sens-là?
The United Nations is considered to be perhaps the best invention of the 20th century. It has been set up as a follow-up of the tragic events in the course of the Second World War. But the United Nations has been developing, evaluating its major principles as soon as the whole situation in the globe, in the world also was changing. The United Nations changed, although there were no changes in the Charter of the United Nations. But the substance of the United Nations dramatically changed. Let's look at the very concrete case or example. How the states pay to the regular budget. The major contributor of to the regular budget of the United Nations is the United States. They pay 22%. But the second largest contributor to the regular budget of the United Nations is Japan, and the third one is Germany. So it shows how the United Nations changed since the end of the Second World War. You know what is the outcome of the Second World War. So we are speaking about reforms in the United Nations. There were a lot of changes or even reforms in the United Nations. Some of them are visible. Some of them are not visible. But it's very much important that the United Nations now is focusing on the real targets, on the real challenges, keeping in mind development, human rights, other key problems that we have to address. And the United Nations, from my point of view, is becoming very quick, very flexible, reacting to the conflicts that unfortunately do happen in certain parts of the world. Let's take as one of the examples the situation in Mali, which is a matter of grave concern. So the Security Council is expected to get a proposal of certain countries, or report of certain countries, to undertake measures, very drastic measures, including military actions with regard to Mali in order to prevent the situation to get worse. And this decision is expected to be taken very soon, so that the international forces might go into Mali in order to settle the situation, which is extremely serious, and if not addressed properly and on time, may have very bad implications, may cause very bad implications, not only to the regional situation, but much beyond. So the United Nations is becoming very much reactive and flexible toward the regional conflicts. And we always keep in mind that it's much better to prevent the conflicts or large-scale wars than to cope with the consequences of the very bad developments and events. So the preventive diplomacy, the need to take drastic measures, radical measures, including military operations on time, are becoming very much accurate in the agenda, in the operative agenda of the United Nations. And I think that it's only a single way to address the problems, to act very quick. Unfortunately, we just mentioned the situation in Syria. This is a special case because, unfortunately, there is no unity among the Security Council. And you know that the resolutions which have been put forward by some countries were not supported by a certain part of the Security Council. It's very bad. But the right for veto has been fixed in the Charter of the United Nations in order to counterbalance all extreme positions or discrepancies. But we believe that sooner or later the Security Council will become more solidified, more consolidated, and more united with regard to these problems like the situation in Syria. Thank you.
We have a question here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Director General, for your talk. Yes, the reform of international organizations, the reform process in WIPO, for example, which is still going on, which called Development Agenda. But experts cannot believe if some reform processes, such as also the reform in ILO, which is ended and without an achievement. And we are talking also on reform in WTO. And can we compare, do you think, Mr. General, can we compare WTO with League of Nations? As you mentioned in your presentations, League of Nations was unsuccessful in the history. But can we believe on an unsuccessfully for the negotiation in WTO? Because we talk on crisis, multilateral crisis, but it is a crisis, especially in UNFCCC. And my second question it is about youth empowerment. You're supporting women empowerment, but you are in favor of youth empowerment? Yes or no? Thank you very much.
I have no comments about the WTO and other organizations you mentioned, but I would, using this opportunity, would like to speak broadly or generally about the reform in the United Nations. We are facing a big challenge of reforming the management. Change management is a priority for the Secretary General. He said that, in some extent, the change management will become his legacy. So we are all involved in the process of making reforms in the United Nations, particularly in change management. UNOC, the office in Geneva, is also involved in this process. I wouldn't say that it's an easy process, but this is a process. And as Director General of UNOC, I'm committed to making reforms. As soon as I came here, I made some reforms with regard to the change management, perhaps minor reforms, but still there were, from my point of view, positive changes that implied positive environment and atmosphere within the team of the United Nations here in Geneva. So each organization, including specialized agencies of the United Nations, have their own peculiarities and specifics. But I'm absolutely sure and convinced that we need reforms. We should not stay on the same point. The reforms are very difficult to perform, to carry out, very difficult. And as a matter of fact, we should acknowledge that people do not want changes. They want to stay easily enjoying life. But the role of the leader, his mission, is to lead the people, to encourage changes. Otherwise, the United Nations, as well as other agencies, international agencies, perhaps those agencies you mentioned, may find themselves in the deadlock, in the stalemate, will die after all. So we are doing reforms in the United Nations. And one of the aspects of those reforms are empowering women and youth, as you mentioned. This is extremely important because we need to encourage women and we need to encourage young people to be greatly involved in the processes, either in building up economies or building up democratic institutions or building up political institutions, not only in the developing countries, but I would say in the developed countries as well. And that's the reason I'm using every opportunity to meet with the younger generation, with the members of GIMON, this Association of Younger Youth Organization. And speaking about women, in UNOC we have a parity, 50-50%. And still, I believe that we have opportunities because my feeling, my personal feeling when I came here, that women, particularly in the United Nations, work better than men. They are more meticulous and more responsible. And I think that we should upgrade the level of the presence of women in the United Nations and in all sectors of the social life. Thank you.
We have time for one more question. The gentleman at the back, I think, was asking.
Merci beaucoup pour votre exposé. J'aurais une toute petite question à vous poser. Vous avez parlé beaucoup du printemps arabe. Qu'en est-il du Bahreïn? Vous avez parlé du Mali. Qu'en est-il de la République démocratique du Congo? Sans parler de l'éternel problème israélo-palestinien. Quel est le rôle de l'ONU dans tout ça?
All these issues you mentioned right now are in the agenda of the United Nations. Speaking about the Democratic Republic of Congo, yes, I agree with you that the situation is very much alarming. We have a special mission of the United Nations in this country. And I was shocked when reading some reports in the newspapers about the current situation with the human rights in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Speaking about the conflict, everlasting conflict in the Middle East. Of course, it is in the agenda of the United Nations. But we should admit that this case cannot be solved overnight. All the major countries are involved in trying to address this conflict. But we should not be presumptuous or over hopeful about or have over expectations with regard to this conflict. We should be realists and pragmatists. But it's very much important that the United Nations does not ignore this problem. And the Secretary General always mentions, and in his speech at the last session of the General Assembly, he was speaking quite eloquently about all these problems. My personal view, and I got the sense of your question. And I would like to reply, not mentioning some other countries, but my personal assessment, my personal feeling, that there should be no dual standards with regard to the countries. We should be unbiased, objective, neutral, but as Secretary General of the United Nations said, we should not be indifferent. We should not be indifferent. And of course, we should be very much objective with regard to the assessment of the policies, either foreign or domestic policies of certain countries. Thank you so much. Mm-hmm.
In a few moments' time, the delegation will be leaving the room, and I would ask you to remain seated until they have left, very kindly. And I would now like to reiterate the thanks that I made about 20 minutes ago, not just for the lecture which Mr. Tokayev gave us, but also for the very informed and developed answers that he gave us to the questions that members of the audience asked. So once again, thank you very, very much for everything you've done for us tonight.
Thank you very much for coming. I hope that I'll be invited in the future on a regular basis in order to address the audience, the students and professors on the international issues. And thank you very much. I do understand that it's 7:00 p.m. Tomorrow is holiday, congé. But anyway, you came here to listen to me. So I really appreciate it. Thank you. Appreciate it.